Ocean Monarch Seminar on Hypnosis, January 1957. Dr. Erickson's discussion on hypnosis in psychiatry.
Not necessarily to demonstrate hypnosis, but to discuss its use in psychiatry. However, the use of hypnosis in psychiatry actually applies to the use of hypnosis in any other medical field, whether it's dental, dermatology, or whatever it might be. Now, I'm going to make certain general statements about hypnosis. The first thing that I want to impress upon you is one way of thinking about your patients clinically. And it is desirable to think that way because of the ease of concept formation for them. I like to regard my patient as having a conscious mind and an unconscious or subconscious mind. And I expect the two to be together in the same person. And I expect both of them to be in the office with me. I also expect that when I'm talking to a person at the conscious level, I expect him to be listening to me at an unconscious level as well as consciously. And therefore, I'm not very greatly concerned about the depth of the trance the patient is in, because I find that one can do extensive and deep psychotherapy in the light trance as well as in the deep or the medium trance. One merely needs to know how to talk to a patient in order to secure therapeutic results. Now, the next thing that I want to stress, and I think this is something that should be stressed over and over again by the panel and stressed by each of you in your own daily practice, the tremendous need of working out a method of suggestion. In working out my own technique, I worked out what I thought was a good hypnotic technique. It was about 30 typewritten pages, single-spaced, of the various types of suggestions necessary to induce a deep trance. And then I slowly cut it down from 30 typewritten pages, single-spaced, to 25, to 20, to 15, to 10, to 5, and so on, so that I could use the whole 30 pages, or I could use just one page or one paragraph. But I learned thoroughly how to graduate my suggestions and how to lead from one suggestion to another. And that is something that you really ought to do. Because when one does that sort of thing, one learns how to follow the leads given by his patient. Now, in inducing a trance in your psychiatric patient, or for that matter, any other type of patient, it's the fashion in which you present the suggestions to the patient. Now, with some of you, I demonstrated this matter of taking a hold of a wrist. Too often, they grab hold of a wrist and they lift it up forcibly. And yet when I did that hand levitation, or rather lifted Pauline's hand, I did it in a very, very gentle fashion, so that there was just a suggestion that I was lifting her arm, and just a suggestion that I was trying to move it this way or that way. And the more gentle you can be on the physical touch of the arm when you're lifting it up in the air to induce catalepsy, the more effective it is. But any forcible seizing of the patient's arm causes you to have difficulty, because you want to stimulate the patient to be responsive to you. Hypnosis is primarily a state in which there's increased responsiveness to ideas of all sorts. And one employs that responsiveness not by trying to force, but by trying to elicit an immediate response. And to elicit it by having the patient participate. In exactly the same way, I do not like this matter of telling a patient, I want you to get tired and sleepy, and get tired and sleepier, because that is an effort to force your wishes upon the patient. That's an effort to dominate the patient. It is much better to suggest that they can get tired, that they can get sleepy, that they can go into a trance. And it's always a matter of offering them an opportunity of responding to an idea. Furthermore, in hypnosis, patients usually have an idea that is a pretty powerful tool, that they can be compelled to do things. And I like to approach my psychiatric patients, whether they're neurotic or just emotionally disturbed or pre-psychotic or even psychotic. I like to approach them in a fashion that lets them feel free to respond to whatever degree that they wish. I never tell a patient that he has to go into a deep trance or a medium trance, or for that matter, into a light trance. I suggest also that he never tell me anything more than he really wants to tell me. I usually tell my patient that he can withhold whatever he wishes, and to be sure to withhold whatever he wishes. I'm bringing that out because I want you to have some understanding of positive and negative suggestions. To tell a patient, now tell me all, is a rather threatening thing. It's a rather dangerous thing to do to a patient. Rather, you want the patient to be willing to tell you this, willing to tell you that. And as they start telling you this and that, they begin to develop a certain sense of confidence. Now and then, of course, you find a patient who's got good rapport with you or in a good situation with you, wherein you can take the dominant attitude. But one really ought to be rather cautious. Flash, do you mind bringing me a glass of water, please? So in the use of positive and negative suggestions, one tries to make it possible for the patient to exercise his own ambivalence for your benefit and for his benefit. He's willing to secure help from you, but he's also unwilling. And so you try to define it, the situation for him, so that he can get help in one direction and so that he can refuse help in another situation. And that way the patient has a readiness to go along with you. Now, in hypnotizing the psychiatric patient, I think one of the important things to do is first to establish a good conscious rapport with the patient, letting him know that you're definitely interested in him and definitely interested in using hypnosis if in your judgment you think it will help. So often you have patients come in and demand that they be hypnotized. And I usually counter with the statement that it's better for the doctor to prescribe rather than for the patient. And that surely if they need hypnosis, if they can benefit from it, I certainly will employ it. And then I ask their permission to employ it in the way that's most helpful to them. And what have I really suggested? I've suggested that it be employed in the way most helpful to them. Usually I go through the preliminary explanation that they're going to remain conscious, but I point out to them that the fact that they can hear the clock on the wall, that they can see the bookcases in the room, that they can hear any disturbing sounds is a rather unimportant thing. That the essential thing is that they pay attention, not necessarily to me, but to pay attention to their own thoughts, especially the thoughts that flash through their minds, and the manner and the sequence in which those thoughts flash through their own minds. Now, hypnosis is something that allows you to manipulate the personality in its various ways of functioning. One can ask a patient in the trance state to remember something of the past, or to speculate upon the future, or to do anything and to shift from one gear, so to speak, to another gear. Too often there is an attempt to follow through in a consistent way on one particular problem long after the patient has become too fatigued or too disturbed emotionally to do that. I think hypnotically one ought to realize that he can always come back to any particular idea or fear or anxiety and never ask a patient to experience too much distress or emotional discomfort at any one time. Now, what are some of the uses of hypnosis in psychiatry? The first, and I think the primary use of it, should be in establishing a good personal relationship with the patient. Because once you hypnotize somebody, they have a feeling very promptly that they can trust you. And you ought to give them the opportunity of discovering that they can trust you. Therefore, I usually ask a patient in a hypnotic trance some question that I know that they should not answer right then. I ask the question, and before they can possibly answer it, point out to them that that's a question that should not yet be answered, and that they ought not to answer until the right time comes along. Then I ask them to think about what I've said, and the result of their thinking is that they decide that they can answer questions freely and easily, but that they are under no compulsion to answer a question before the right time comes. I do that in the waking state. I do it in the trance state. Because you are dealing with a person who has both a conscious mind and an unconscious mind. And that is another important thing in psychiatry and in the use of hypnosis. Just because you've done good work with a patient in a deep trance does not mean that the patient will benefit from it in the ordinary waking state. There has to be an integration of unconscious learnings with conscious learnings. And that should be foremost in your mind whenever you use hypnosis on psychiatric patients. You can recognize that you can resolve a conflict, a phobia, or an anxiety in the trance state. But unless you do something about it in the waking state, the patient is still likely to have that anxiety or phobia. And thus to remove a phobia for a certain color in the trance state so that the patient can behave normally. Nevertheless, when they awaken from the trance state, they still have conscious habit patterns of response to that particular thing. And therefore you have to integrate their unconscious learnings with their conscious learnings. In the recovery of traumatic experiences, the girl who developed a fear of the color blue because she saw her sister when the sister nearly drowned and was decidedly blue in appearance. The patient didn't really recover from that, even though she could handle anything blue and look at anything blue in the trance state. She didn't really recover until in the waking state she had a feeling of conscious comfort in dealing with blue cloth and blue colors of all sorts. She did not necessarily have to have a complete knowledge of her sister's near drowning, but she did have to have an awareness that blue used to be associated with decidedly uncomfortable feelings. And so, always in dealing with patients, you've got to speculate upon the need of integrating unconscious learnings with conscious learnings. And you need to decide how rapidly and how thoroughly you should do that. Now, another thing about hypnosis is this, that you can divide up your patient's problems. That is, a patient with some traumatic experience in the past that's resulted, let us say, in a phobic reaction or an anxiety state. One can put him in a deep trance and suggest that he recover only the emotional values of that experience, the emotional aspects of that experience. Just as in the past, to demonstrate the fact that hypnotic subjects can have emotion, I had one of my demonstration subjects recover all of the merriment of a joke without knowing what the joke was that the subject was laughing at. And yet my subject laughed and laughed in the most merry fashion over the joke, wondering at the time what the joke was. Then later I let my subject remember what the joke was. In other words, one can split off the intellectual aspects of a problem and leave only the emotional aspects of the problem. One can have a patient cry out very thoroughly about the emotional aspects of a traumatic experience, and then let them recover the actual intellectual content of that traumatic experience. Or one can do it in a jigsaw fashion. That is, let them recover a little bit of the intellectual content of a traumatic experience of the past, a little bit of the intellectual content, a little bit of the emotional content, not necessarily connected parts. And thus you let the young medical student see the pitchfork. And then you can let him feel the pain he experienced on the gluteal regions. And then you can let him see the color green. And then you can let him feel himself stiff and rigid, and in a horrified fashion of stiffness and rigidity, in a jigsaw fashion, and recover an entire traumatic experience that was governing his behavior in medical school and which was handicapping him very seriously, a forgotten traumatic experience of his childhood. This possibility also of inducing a complete memory of traumatic experiences and then inducing an amnesia for it. Often patients come to you not knowing why they are unhappy or distressed or disturbed in any way. They're just unaware of it. They just know that they're unhappy, and they give you a wealth of rationalizations for it. Things aren't going right, the mortgage is too much of a burden, the job is too difficult, when actually it may be their father relationships, their mother relationships of childhood. One can actually regress the patient, return them to their childhood, get them to remember things the way Olive did the other day, when she recalled the memory of burying that kitten in the ground, and then laughing so merrily and thinking she was such a horrible creature. One can secure all of that information from the patient and have a complete understanding of many things about the patient, and yet awaken the patient with a total amnesia for what they have told you. But you now know what the patient is talking about. The patient doesn't know what he is talking about. You do. And therefore you can guide the patient's thinking and their speaking until they approach the actual problem more and more closely. You can detect the significant words so that you understand what they are talking about. And in that regard, you need the practice of repeatedly trying to get a patient to talk about something in ordinary everyday life. You need the practice of using normal hypnotic subjects and trying to get them to talk about the lighting in the corner of the room. Not because it's important, but how can you get them to talk about the lighting in the corner of the room? You merely need to watch their ordinary utterances and casual conversation and emphasize the fact that all of a sudden they said the word corner, and you wonder why. And pretty soon they'll say something is light, and very shortly you can be having them talking about the lighting in the corner of the room. It's a matter of directing them. And as long as you know some of the traumatic past of the subject, you can guide every one of your remarks to them. Now, what are some of the things that you really need to do in using hypnosis? Your patients in the psychiatric field are often exceedingly difficult. They're fearful to begin with. They're distressed. And they do not know how to handle themselves, so they would not be your patient. You can employ all of the various hypnotic phenomena. I can recall one of my patients who came to me and tried to spend the time in explaining to me that he just could not talk to me. There was nothing he had to say. He felt too bad to be able to have any thoughts. And my statement was simply this, that he could go into a light trance and experience some rather interesting and rather helpful phenomena. He agreed that he needed some help, but he didn't know how to get it. And so, apparently in a random fashion, I stated that I could place a chair right there, that it would be just about so far from the bookcase, about so far from the door, about so far from my desk, and it would be really very nice to sit in that chair and be able to talk when sitting in that chair. And my patient tended to agree with me that if there were a chair there, it would be so far from the bookcase, it would be so far from my desk, it would be so far from the door. Now there I've gotten listed 3 excellent agreements from my patient. And then the statement that if he were sitting in a chair in such and such a relationship, he might find it helpful to him in talking. Well, of course, he risked nothing by saying that he might find it helpful if he sat there in that chair. Since there was no chair there, I hadn't had him hallucinate one. I just had him imagine it, just as all of you can. But what is the subject really doing? He's agreeing with me without knowing it, that in a different position in the office he would find it helpful and he would find it possible for him to talk freely. And then I suggested that it was impossible for him to talk in this chair, the one that he was sitting in, and all it would really be necessary for him to do would be to take this chair and put it over there and sit down in it and start talking. And I've had my patient more than once pick up his chair, move it to another side of the room, and immediately begin discussing his problems and giving me the information he needed to give, because he left all of his resistances in the room orientation that he had when sitting in this chair. But sitting in that chair, which was this one moved over there, he saw the room in a different way entirely. He was spatially differently oriented. And whatever you can do to alter the orientation of your patients psychiatrically in the office aids them tremendously in communicating with you and examining their problems. Hypnotically, of course, it's very easy to induce a deep trance and reorient them completely, to depersonalize them. That's one reason why I emphasize the importance to all of you, no matter what field of medicine you're in, to work with normal subjects. Any of you who live in college towns or university towns ought to get in touch with the psychology students. There you'll have a group of normal subjects who are interested, with whom you can work, and a little time spent with them will enable you to discover all of the various hypnotic phenomena. And you never know when it's going to be handy to employ this particular phenomenon or that particular one. This matter of depersonalization, this matter of the projection of the self. You can teach a subject to see a movie screen up there and to see the self there. A technique that I like very much is to have a movie screen and have my patient look at it. I can have my patient forget his name, his identity, forget everything about himself, the way all of us do ordinarily, normally in the theater when we are observing a suspense movie or anything else that's completely absorbing of our attention. Have that subject look at that screen and you tell him that he's going to see a continuous series of events. And you can have them in the form of moving pictures, or you can have them in the form of stills. I think of one patient, a sad sack, who came to me, and the question was, could one ever make a man out of that sad sack? I was challenged to do that, to conduct psychotherapy on that man using hypnosis, and having an audience of antagonistic psychoanalysts and residents in psychiatry, some of whom were undergoing psychoanalysis. The rather simple procedure I used with the sad sack was this. Harvey had every known ache and pain, every known sense of inferiority. But Harvey was intelligent, even though he didn't manifest much intelligence. He was fearful.